As we mentioned at the top of our show, Kyle Rittenhouse is now a free young man. The jury announced its verdict just after noon today, acquitting Rittenhouse of all charges. Now, this decision was cheered by some, and it shocked others. Well, we've called on Professor Jody Madeira of the Maurer School of Law at Indiana University to talk about the verdict and the trial. Professor Madeira, thank you so much for joining us. First off, your reaction to the verdict.
Well, I think my reaction is very similar to other members of the legal profession. I don't think we're surprised, even though we're very saddened by the outcome.
Well, let's talk about the evidence in the testimony. What of that stood out to you that may have swayed the jury in this case, or was it merely the fact, as you pointed out, that there was some things kept out that should have been in your opinion?
Yes, well, I think, there's the narrative that was presented by the defense, skillfully, that this was a self-defense move, and that ignores, of course, that this individual chose to go downtown at the behest of the owner of a car dealership to protect property, which is never worth, the taking of lives. But I think, again, it's just this narrative that was set in place that's very attractive, that once somebody is set upon, it's a legitimate self-defense claim. In addition, the judge made several rulings that I think favored the defense, and that set the tone for the trial.
Well, what does this say about self-defense? You mentioned just a second ago that it doesn't legitimize people just walking out in a situation like that with a gun and shooting people. But what does this say about self-defense?
I think the narratives of self-defense in America just got immeasurably complicated in very problematic ways, and like Wisconsin, Indiana, the Midwest, we all have very healthy gun cultures. And, now it's unclear under what circumstances an individual who should not possess a firearm, who's too young to basically carry a firearm, to possess a firearm of that magnitude, under those circumstances, can this individual carry the weapon into a situation which arguably is very provocative, makes him a target, and then claim self-defense? And I think the answer to that question beforehand, many people would have said no, and the answer to that question now is just unknown.
You mentioned a young person, Kyle Rittenhouse, carrying a gun into the situation. The judge threw out that charge of possession of a firearm for a person under the age of 18. He was 17 at the time. What are your thoughts about that being thrown out?
My thought is that it's actually was thrown out because it was a technical issue. The defense drug up a very convincing argument, that basically he was allowed to possess that firearm. And, I believe that that's when you get into questions like the prosecution might have overcharged. Certainly that charge appeared to be open and shut, but it had a loophole, which I think the prosecution unfortunately did not know about. And I think that might have created the optics that the prosecution was just trying to get Rittenhouse really at any cost, which is unprofessional. Which the jury might have perceived as unprofessional.
Yeah, and you mentioned early on, too, about some missteps. Now, obviously, that could be what you just stated, one of them. What other missteps are we talking about that cost them this trial?
Well, I think it can't be blamed solely on the prosecution's activities, but there were several instances where the prosecution sort of rubbed the judge the wrong way. Again, ignoring what's called a motion in limine and trying to present evidence that the judge had wanted to keep out of the trial instead of just preserving that issue and, making a note of it. The kerfluffle over calling the individuals who died victims, the issue of perhaps sending the video, in a format which would have rendered it low quality. And only presenting this high quality enhanced footage at the last moment. I think that there were just several unfortunate aspects, which I'm not sure that they would have changed the outcome of the trial, but they didn't make the prosecution look very professional.
Well, Professor Jody Madeira, I apologize. We are running out of time. So much we could talk about here, but we certainly appreciate you taking the time today to talk with us from the IU Maurer School of Law. Thank you so much for taking the time today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.